this week's In Conversation of the Practice and as Research Network. My name is Nicole Brown, and I am in conversation today with a very special guest from UCL, University College London, Professor Haidy Geismar, who is a professor of anthropology. Can I just say welcome and thank you very much for the time of yours today with us.
Thanks, Nicole. It's lovely to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Great, thank you. So let's start straight away with the first kind of question that I've got prepared for you. What is your definition of practice as research, seeing that this is for the Practice as Research Network?
Thank you. I've been trying to think about my answer to that actually for a little while. So as you mentioned, I'm an anthropologist, and I think we have quite an interesting experience of practice because I think we're still one of the few disciplines that requires this kind of middle period in our doctoral research to be dedicated to long-term and immersive field work. And I'm an anthropologist of museums, so all of my work takes place in museums where I work with curators, conservators, cultural communities, artists, and everyone else attached to those kinds of groups. So obviously practice is something that I think about a lot in my own work. It doesn't always align with the way in which practice is sometimes talked about in academic fields, however. So for me, fieldwork is very much a practice. It's about how you situate your academic ideas and thinking in the world. And it very much not only just in dialogue with other people and people outside the university, but through the things that they are doing, as well as the things that you are doing. But then, of course, museum practice is a very lively, very well-defined field that I've been lucky to have lots of opportunity to explore through my research. And so in particular, I've had a chance to think about practices of things like collecting, of curating, and more recently in collaborations that I've had with conservators, conserving and managing collections or collections care. So those are all practices that inflect my practice, my thinking as a researcher. And I also think of, and I suppose I do think of everything I do in terms of practice. So I think of writing and reading as practices as well, and speaking and disseminating work across a wide range of different media, actually. So one of the things I do at UCL is convene with colleagues a digital anthropology master's program and research program. And so we very much think about how digital media affords new forms of practice, both for research and within social worlds.
Thank you. I mean, one of the things that I find particularly interesting about the practice as research is, where do we draw the line? So where is it just practice, and just not in the sense of, just as pejorative, just as in only, where is it purely only practice? And where is it practice and research combined into one? And that's the part that I'm particularly interested in and trying to kind of explore with colleagues like yourself, where I'm trying to kind of identify, well, how do you define or describe your work? Is it practice? Is it practice as research combined? And how do you, in your own mind, in a way, split the two into two pieces? Or can you not? I don't know. I'm just trying to explore that.
I think that answer to that question is really different when you're working inside a university or outside of it, actually, because I think that we've having a lot of really productive conversations in anthropology, actually, about practice. So we now have a PhD by practice in the anthropology department, and the field in general has been much more open in recent years to taking things like film and photography and even exhibition curation as equivalent to text, as forms of practice that are very much recognized as research and valued as research. And now I think you can even submit exhibitions and films for ref, for example. So there's a very open exploration around practice that's happening in anthropology, and I think in the university, particularly our corner of social science and humanities research. But those boundaries are not quite as porous, I think, outside the university. And I've really seen that in the conversations that I have through my own research with museum practitioners who feel, and I think some of it is about the stakes and the forms of accountability that you have within your work, who you are accountable, and then what and how that accountability is measured. And it often seems to be that the kind of luxury of critical engagement and reflection and experiment with all of the opportunities to fail or reach dead ends or change course that we have in university research are not luxuries that other people feel they have within their working lives, and that their practice therefore is delineated more, or I suppose strictly, around things like professional standards, around accountability structures, and those kinds of places and values that are kind of community created, but they can also be very top down, and they can be experienced, I think, in constraining ways. But then I think they also, from the conversations that I have with practitioners, are seen as kind of forms of groundedness that perhaps are harder to grasp onto in this ever open conversation about practice that we have in the university context within our practice as researchers. So I think it's quite interesting that there are clearer boundaries often in museums about what's research and what's practice. And it's fascinating to see, for example, I've just come off, last year I was a research fellow at the Tate in a Mellon-funded project, which was exactly asking this question. It's in the research department of the collections care division, run by Pip Lawrenson, who's the head of collections care research. And it was very much looking at new practices and theories of collections care and how some of the new thinking about art that is not conventional, so ever-changing archives of social activity or digital objects, how we can use research into those areas to inform current museum practice and create best practice in the museum. And so, yeah, so that's very interesting. And it was very clear that one of the objectives, I think, of that was to give practitioners, so people working in conservation and in archives, the opportunity to develop their own research, because often that time is really squeezed in the museum setting for people like conservators who have to respond to very tight pressures and very tight budgets around caring for objects, for example.
Thank you. I mean, that's really interesting, because I've kind of, I've had a few of these conversations now, and one of the things that has come out is that it is so difficult to identify and categorize what we do. And I'm not sure that it's a good thing that we need to categorize it in a way, but in reality, for example, because you were talking about accountability structures and professional standards, this is bringing me back to the idea of how poets as researchers, for whom the poetry is the practice, are sitting in kind of a different field, if you like, because I mean, who decides on whether you or not you're a poet? It's almost in your own mind, is your own mindset. There aren't any kind of professional standards other than, okay, have you been published or not? But you can still consider yourself a poet even if you haven't been published. So it's somebody who's doing poetry as research, as practice, as research elements, is probably going to be struggling to kind of find that accountability structure and the professional standards that you just mentioned within the museums and collect conservatoires. So that's the kind of thing that's really interesting to kind of hear how actually different disciplines are looking at the same thing from quite a different vantage point, if you like.
Well, I think for practitioners, people who are just doing things, like it's not just in a lesser way, people who are starting from a place of what they're doing, I think often look to try to demystify what the value structures and structures of accountability are in research. And that is actually quite mystifying for many people. And that has the same kind of structure actually as the one that I was describing in the practitioner contexts that I was referring to earlier, because we have quite clear codes of practice and codes, structures of accountability and of value in research. Accountability around things like ethics, values around things like research rankings and audits, or peer review processes and so on. So I think both sides, if we see them as separate, come from different kinds of worlds in a way, or ways of thinking. It's interesting though, to perceive that there are really still boundaries that people feel are in place, that I think often practitioners can find it hard to imagine how they can get into research or have what they are doing recognized as research.
Yes.
And vice versa, researchers can struggle to really, or can wonder how they can have what they are recognized as doing as a practice. I think it's easier that way around, because we have quite well established discourses of teaching as a practice and writing as a practice, and we are absorbing other forms of practice into the academy. Whereas I think it's actually quite challenging for people working outside of research contexts to develop that side of their practice. So in a way, that's where we need to bring the boundaries down more, or be better at sharing our toolkits.
I think, yeah, thank you. I think I agree. I think there, what you've just described is very often the case within teacher education and teacher practices in secondary schools or primary schools, for example. There are teachers who are obviously practitioners in the classroom, but they don't actually have access to journal articles the way we do at university level, and therefore their research practice will never be quite as in-depth as ours, because it's an accessibility issue as well. It's not just that, you know, the kind of the value or the recognition is different. It's even practicalities are different. So I totally see where you're coming from. Can I just ask, what about your own practice? Are you doing practice as research? Are you a practitioner, a researcher, a research practitioner? How do you define your own work in those terms that we've just talked about?
I wouldn't call myself a research practitioner, but I've always thought about what I do as forms of practice. At the moment, I'm largely absorbed with developing our new campus at UCL East. And so my research is more writing than it is doing kind of primary research, because I haven't had the space for that in the last few months. But before that, I definitely have what I would call a kind of experimental practice that forms the backbone of a lot of my research, which has been, and as I refer to museums, it's really to explore how museum practices can be generative, not just of my research to create research data, but generative of social relationships that then also become part of my research. So I have used collecting as a practice to then study and research. So by having funds from museums to actually create new collections and explore how we can do that in collaborative or co-produced ways, and using collecting as a vehicle to explore questions of identity or value and so on. I've looked at curating in a similar way, so putting together exhibitions. I've curated numerous exhibitions, and those have very much for me been research practice in terms of using the actual process of exhibition making as a form of knowledge generation. And I've actually translated that into student-led projects as well, where before I came to UCL, I taught at NYU, half in anthropology and half in museum studies. And I was frustrated because NYU didn't have a kind of university museum in the vein of some of the illustrious universities in both America and the UK. And so I made a class which was called Making a Museum. And then we had several iterations of the class where we brought museum studies students together with students in another department or discipline. Once it was history, for example. And they worked together on a shared question, and they used the medium or the practice of exhibition making and archiving and collecting to explore that question as a form of research for the class. And the class ended up co-curating an exhibition. And we did that several times to really fantastic effect, putting on really great exhibitions. So I definitely think of exhibiting and curating as an important form of my practice. And then more recently, I've been exploring digital platforms and practices of digital collecting and digital archiving, and using those as kind of windows into how people construct classifications that are meaningful and valuable, and how those vary from place and time, across places and across time.
That's really fascinating. Can I just ask, out of interest, personal interest, almost like as a sidestep here, how did you assess the student work when you're saying that you got them to curate an exhibit and put together their own museum in a way? What was the assessment for that particular module? Is that then the curation, the exhibition, or is it the critical commentary, or is it a little bit of all of this?
Yeah, it was a bit of everything. So I think you have to, when you do those kinds of projects with students, because obviously there's a form of training for students in place, so it's not quite the same as a curatorial project that you would be running on your own. You have to impose a bit more structure on them than curators. Yes. For them as curators, you're still being a bit more prescriptive. So they had certain tasks that they had to undertake across the program, which was undertaking research, creating, I think, so I'm just thinking one of my favorite example was a course that we did with the New York Department of Sanitation, which was to make visible the labor of sanitation workers and to pave the ground for a museum of sanitation, because in New York, there's a police museum, a fire department museum, there's a transit authority museum, but there's no recognition in that way of sanitation labor, even though it's actually the most dangerous work out of all of those services. You're much more likely to die on the job if you're a sanitation worker, and it's probably the most necessary, because one day missing of the garbage collection and you really see it.
COVID would have shown as well, actually.
Yeah. So and actually so the students had various things they had to do, which was they had to do an oral history interview with a sanitation worker. They each had in small groups a panel, a text and image panel that they had to create for the exhibition. So they had to select the images and write the text for that. And then they had to do some creative writing and some historical research, which was evaluated through an essay. And then that all got put together in the final exhibition.
Thank you. I mean, the reason why I asked is obviously as part of the practice as research, I'm always asking myself two questions. The one is, where is the difference, or, between pure research, pure practice, or practice as research? That's the one thing that I'm interested in. And the other thing is, what's the outcome of that practice as research? And in some cases, the outcome is quite tangible, because an artist painter, for example, a painter researcher, obviously the outcome is the painting. So I've got something quite tangible to look at. But I can imagine that with curating, unless you've got the actual exhibition, the process of curation as to what have you chosen and what did you not choose, that's again something that's quite intangible and hidden. That's not necessarily, you can see the final things that have been chosen, but you can't see what's not there in a way. So that's the part that I'm interested in, is, what's the outcome of practice as research, and does it require therefore the critical commentary in, for example, an essay or in as a presentation, in order to understand the outcome that's there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the great thing when you're doing these sorts of activities through teaching is that that's often the focus of the class. So it's often they're choosing things, but they're being taught to reflect critically on what isn't there.
Yes.
So that those things become more visible actually than they would perhaps in a museum exhibition
on their own. Yes,
because
absolutely.
Part of the training is to make students reflect. Well, do you author your labels, or what's the curatorial voice and whose is it, or all those sorts of questions. So in a way, teaching is a great valve to kind of release some of that into the wild. And really bring some of that critical thinking out into the kind of visible and tangible outputs that the students are making themselves. So
thank you. That's really interesting. Can I just ask you, in your view, what do you think are the challenges of practice as research?
I think assessment is massive, because I mean, when I say assessment, obviously by assessment I'm referring to how you might mark somebody's work or evaluate somebody's work, whether it's a student essay or it could all be a PhD dissertation, but it could also be an output of an academic who's hoping to be included in an audit like REF. But I don't just mean assessment in that narrow way, because I think it's about standardizing or value systems, or recognizing when practice is successful or works and when it isn't. And I think that's a real challenge. It's, we started out by talking about how both practice and research are constrained by these kinds of value communities and structures and hierarchies of value. But actually, I think that's the real kind of, heart of the question, which is about how you recognize whether practice is successful or good in some way, and therefore worthwhile. Because it's quite easy to say, and I think in the university context, again, which is where I'm talking about mainly, it's lower risk. It's quite easy to say, this is my practice and I've explored it, but you don't have to justify yourself in the same way that you do if you were being exhibited at the Tate, for example, to millions of people at that visit every year, because you can frame what you've done as exploratory, as partial, as just beginning. You can use it as a platform to say, well, and this showed me what skills I need and where, and made me think about where I could get them from. Whereas that's not, you can't do that. If you wouldn't be able to submit that film to a film festival and have it win a prize, for example.
No, that's definitely, yeah, it has to be accomplished and polished, a final piece, really, hasn't it?
Yeah, so it's the value of practice, again, inside research activities in the university is quite different to practice as a kind of object that then is valued in other contexts, and trying to light on kind of consensus around standards and when things have worked, I think is really challenging, because my feeling is, as much as that's problematic, it is important, it is necessary to have to at least be aware of the values that we ascribe to practices, and when we think things are important, and when we think things are skilled, and when we think things come from a kind of place of consideration and a place of kind of effort, rather than just the fact that they exist, making them as completely legitimate as anything as legitimate as something else. I sound like I'm being very judgmental and hierarchical.
No, you don't. No, not at all.
I think that's the big challenge. That's the challenge. I mean, I think there's so much buried in that, because there in that is all hierarchy, traditions of exclusion, questions of class and gender, questions of colonialism and history. So it's not straightforward.
But what's interesting for me is, like you're saying, in a way, within the museum context, it's easier to be a research practitioner, somebody who's doing research as practice or practice as research at university level, because you can kind of make those mistakes, and it can be half finished still. It doesn't quite have to be the polished piece that it would have to be if it goes to a film festival or to the Tate. But at the same time, isn't it true that when people write about that kind of work, they don't actually talk about their failures, that the kind of the weaknesses are glossed over? Anything that's kind of seen as potentially, well, actually, I didn't quite get there. I didn't quite have the skill to complete this properly. You kind of, I don't know, yeah, you gloss it over. You're not necessarily thinking, reflecting on it publicly. It may be something that you're doing in your private space, but as things get published as an outcome or as an output in a journal article or in a book or as a film, those things get glossed over.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole role of failure probably is pervasive across, or the hidden role of failure is pervasive across many fields. I mean, scientific research as well, because there's such intense pressure to perform, to have successful results, whereas we all know that experimentation requires failure. Failure is generative. So yeah, I think there's a lot of tension that comes in that. I suppose one of the massive constraints in the area that I work at is also the kind of really peculiar value strictures that have emerged in the art world, and the weird lines that get drawn about what is good or successful there, which are, really problematic, and which often reflect the market more than academic research, or which reflect very complex geopolitics and hierarchies, cultural hierarchies and things like that. So I'll never forget making a collection in Vanuatu and taking it back to the Cambridge Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, which had given me the funding to do that. And one of the curators being really disparaging about the contemporary art that I had collected, saying basically this is primitive contemporary art. And in Vanuatu as a country, it's a country with no art school. It's a country where there's no art supply shop in the whole country. So people who are practicing as contemporary artists are, you know, they may have had some rudimentary art training at secondary school, but they're basically really working hard to participate in the global art world with very limited resources and very limited opportunities. And a lot of what they're doing is actually reflecting on the place of contemporary art in how they imagine themselves as traditional or customary practitioners. So there's a very interesting internal conversation as well that's going on through the medium of contemporary art. But yes, I mean, would it be exhibited at the Tate? Would it, you know, could it be exhibited at the Tate without it falling into a kind of primitive or folk art or indigenous art slot? I mean, these are all really important questions that come up a lot.
That's really interesting that you say that, because especially within sort of modern art, when you look at a Pollock, for example, a lot of people are saying, well, actually my 5-year-old who goes to nursery or kindergarten or whatever could have done those blots on the piece of paper. And in many ways, I can understand where people are coming from. But then to hear that you saying that somebody else says, well, this is a primitive art and therefore it's no good, is really interesting, because what makes the one splot on paper so valuable that it's worth several £million, and on the other hand, something that's developed is then, you know, put aside and put off in a way.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, the art market and the art world is still incredibly colonial and Eurocentric in general. I mean, I say Eurocentric, I mean, there are other centres, there are Asian centres that aren't looking to Europe, you know, Chinese art worlds that don't look to Europe as reference points, but they are, the way in which cultural hierarchies are inscribed in art worlds is very powerful still. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. So can I just ask you, I know that you've obviously got huge projects on the go at the moment, especially with UCL East. But what are your plans really to developing your own research practice, and how would you want this field to kind of progress further?
Well, I mean, actually, so I think of UCL East as having been an amazing opportunity to explore these questions, but at a kind of institutional level, because really what we have done in our part of the new campus development is elevate practice and really put practice forward into several of our kind of existing disciplines and areas of interest. So so it's not, I don't think it's strictly research for me, because I'm not writing about it yet, although maybe I will. But I mean, the opportunity to envisage new kinds of spaces for us to work in, for example, has been really, really exciting. So we have 2 new spaces which are going to really, I think, break down the boundaries between research, teaching, engagement, through this idea of practice. And the practices are things like curating, collecting and exhibiting, but also archiving and collecting, working with collections-based research, the practice of public history, for example. So it's been really exciting to kind of, I mean, what the thing I've been thinking about a lot the last few days is the object learning space that we're developing, because it's a real opportunity to develop a university collection space that starts in the moment that we're in now, with all of the debates that we're having about the validity of historic collections and their legacy in the present day, problems and the powers of kind of display, practices of display that often are perceived to inscribe hierarchies, cultural and racial and other kinds of hierarchies. We can kind of take that and then think, well, what would we do if we could start from now with something new? And that's kind of what we are doing. So I'm really engaged in that at the moment, thinking about that. So it might not be strictly research, but it's taking all my research power and thinking to be translated into a very grounded building project, which also is about building new academic programs. So, you know, championing a new BA in heritage, which the Institute of Archaeology is going to put on.
Yes.
New masters in public history, which the history department is going to be putting on from September. So that's been
So
where
there's
my
a lot,
energy's been in that.
going on then. Yes, yes. Well, thank you very much indeed for your time. I don't want to keep you any longer. I really appreciate the time with you. It was lovely talking to you. It's really exciting to hear about all of these different projects that you've got in mind, but also about your own thoughts on what practice as research means from your background as an anthropologist and working with museum collections. That's really exciting. Anyone who's listening in, I would just like to say, please do check out the website for more on the podcasts and also on the YouTube channel from the Practice as Research Network seminar series. And do get in touch. Thank you.